everybody, and welcome back to the Practice Makes Faithful podcast. Thank you all so much for joining us again today, or whenever you are listening to this. And today I am Ben Patterson, and I'm joined by Paul Hugarbart.
Yep, we're here, ready to rock and roll. It's a super rainy day outside.
Yes, it is.
But the first time we've had rain in 3 weeks, so
yeah, it's been a hot minute.
I guess we're going to take it. So it's good. Get all 3 weeks worth of rain in one day. So wherever you are, I hope. Well, if you like the rain, I hope you're having some rain, and if you like the sun, I hope you have some sun.
Yep, there you go. There's our wishes for you.
Tomorrow. That's right.
And today we are in the fourth part of our series, Under Pressure. This has been our May series. Next week we will conclude that series. And by the way, stay tuned for the end of the podcast today. We got just a couple of housekeeping notes to let you know about the podcast. We'll tell you that in the very end. But
that's right.
As for next week. But for today, we're going to continue in this series, Under Pressure. It's a series on the book of 1 Thessalonians. So, Paul, we were in part 4. Why don't you go ahead and, I guess first off, just give us a quick recap of the series. Where have we been in this series up to this point?
Yeah, so it's really important, again, to remember that this is a series about what it looks like to live life under pressure. It's looking at a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Thessalonian Christians. This is 1 Thessalonians, we call this. We know he wrote another letter. He may have written others too, we just don't have them. So we have 1 and 2 Thessalonians. This was probably the first letter that he wrote to any Christians that we have kind of record of. And he was writing because they were under pressure. If you remember last week, we talked about the fact that he actually sent his young disciple apprentice, Timothy, to go see how the Christians in Thessalonica were doing, because he was so worried about them that they were maybe walking away from faith. That was his concern. They're under so much pressure for living their faith, for following Jesus, for making the choice to follow Jesus, that they're going to walk away. They're going to leave this all behind. And so really that's kind of where we've been to this point in the series, is looking at what it looks like to live under pressure. Kind of the whole thesis of this series is that the Thessalonian Christians, because of their faith, the fact that they lived faithfully under pressure, they've got a lot to teach us as well. And so for this particular week, we moved into chapter 4. Chapter 4 is, again, obviously comes on the heels of chapter 3, but the thoughts of chapter 3, if you remember, are just Paul rejoicing over the faith of the Thessalonian Christians in spite of the pressure that they were facing. So he's just excited as can be. If you remember last week talking about the fact that, he says he feels like as though now he can really truly live because of the faith that he sees in them. So that moves him into chapter 4, and you would think that, on the heels of commending them the way that he did, that maybe chapter 4 would be more of that. But chapter 4 takes on a little bit of a different tone. They are really truly living the life that he has called them to live, really that ultimately God called them to live. But instead of spending another chapter telling them about how great that is and how great they're doing, Paul actually says, listen, this life that you're living, don't become satisfied. Keep going at it. More of it. So he, in fact, 2 different times he says, do what you're doing now more and more, about 2 different things. So the first one is this idea of holiness and sanctification. The second idea is the idea of love. And Paul says, as it relates to holiness and sanctification, do this more and more. So this is what you're doing. And as it relates to love, loving each other, loving others, same thing. Do this more and more. So don't be satisfied. Don't stop doing what you're doing. Don't stop living the way you're living. Don't get to the point, and really I think that's kind of what he's saying, and maybe there's this human tendency we talked about this on Sunday as well, that oftentimes when we arrive at a place that is pretty good, we decide that pretty good is good enough.
Yeah.
Or just that good is good enough. Isn't good good enough? And especially when you're under pressure, you might be even more tempted to say, and certainly you would have thought that might be true about the Thessalonian Christians, and I think Paul is actually anticipating that as he is telling them, don't stop doing what you're doing. Don't ever get to that place where you feel like, especially in relation to your life in Christ, don't ever get to the place where you determine that good enough is good enough. So keep pushing through. To be a follower of Jesus means that every day we have the goal to look more like Jesus than we did the day before. So really that kind of is, in a sense, that is chapter 4. I shared as well. I think this is something that a friend of mine, a guy named Harry Brown, who works with New Generations, said this summer when I was with him. And he said it several times. And the first time he said it, it almost bothered me just a little bit. It created a tension within me. As he said these words, he says, God is easily pleased, but he's impossible to satisfy. I'm thinking, wait a minute, God is impossible to satisfy? It just, in my mind somehow, it almost seems if God is never satisfied, I think it may be about people who are never satisfied. Yeah. But often people who are never satisfied are satisfied because they can never get enough to please them, right? Mm-hmm. But God is wanting not necessarily just things from us, but he's always also and always wanting things for us. So he's wanting good things for us. The good thing that he wants is that we become more like Jesus every day. So when you put it in that light, when you frame it that way, it's understandable why God is easily pleased as we take steps day by day to becoming more like Christ. And I think that's what the Apostle Paul was saying to the Christians at Thessalonica. As you day by day take steps to become more like Jesus, God is there cheering you on, excited about it. But there's never a day, until it is the last day, there's never a day where you reach the last day of trying to become more like Jesus. Mm-hmm. So in that, God is easily pleased, but he's impossible to satisfy. And so really, I think that kind of quote, that thought set the tone for the message this Sunday, and kind of gives you a snapshot of what chapter 4 is all about. So definitely kind of a fun chapter. The Apostle Paul hops around a little bit, but all of it really ties back to kind of that central theme, that central idea.
That's good. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. That's a helpful recap of the series and a little bit into this week's message as well. So I guess one of the things that you did talk about in this is you kind of talked about this prevailing idea in our culture, and you said that the message of culture is that we need to let go of, we need to cast off our inhibitions. And you quoted a book on that, and
yes.
A lady kind of sharing some of her thoughts on that attitude, and really making this case that this is the prevailing attitude both in our culture and then even in the Thessalonians culture. So would you share a little bit more about that sentiment of why would you see that as such a problem, and just what that even means?
Yeah, so I think when we think about where do the pressures that we as Christians face come from, it's oftentimes some of those pressures, maybe even most of those pressures, are from the culture around us. Mm-hmm. To be different than we're called to be. So it's to conform to culture instead of being conformed to the way of God. Okay. Right? So we talked about on Sunday that God has this vision for every Christian life, and that the vision that he has for every Christian is sainthood. Mm-hmm. Now, it was interesting when I said that. I see there are a few people saying, wait a minute, every Christian? I mean, that is the vision of God for every Christian, that we would all be saints?
What do you mean by that when you say sainthood?
Well, maybe we could talk about what we think about first when we hear the word sainthood, right? So I
think of a Catholic saint.
Right.
It's the first thing that comes to my mind.
So we think about
someone who's performed 2 miracles and who's been put as a saint.
That's right. So there's a standard. You can perform those miracles while you're alive, or maybe you could somehow perform those miracles once you're gone too, because some perform miracles after they're gone and then become saints afterwards. But yeah, so that when you think about that, if that was the standard, that you have to perform at least a couple of miracles, how many of us would qualify for sainthood? Yeah. But really, when we get to the biblical picture of sainthood, and for somebody who's raised in a Catholic tradition, this may cause some tension. And I think maybe even for some of our folks who have a Catholic background, you look at that and say, okay, wait a minute. The Catholic Church has defined sainthood this way, and these are the people that we elevate, even pray to saints, right? Mm-hmm. So light a candle for a saint, there's a saint over this, or there's a saint over that, and there's a saint over the other thing, right? So the Christian or the biblical picture of sainthood is more, it's just a way to name those who are in the process of being sanctified by God. Mm-hmm. So day by day becoming more like Jesus. The Greek word for sanctification and holiness has at its heart the same root, so hagia, right?
Okay.
So it's this idea of being holy. It's this idea of being sanctified.
Does the word saint come from the word sanctified?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So the word saint comes from the word sanctified.
Okay.
So you think about the Apostle Paul in most of his letters, by the way, opens up his letters with a greeting to all the saints in Rome, or all the saints in Ephesus, all the saints in Corinth. Now, if you think about the saints in Corinth in particular, Paul is calling this church and the people who make up this church, who, by the way, were a hot mess.
Yeah.
Paul is calling them saints, right? They were divided all over the place. They were screwing up the Lord's Supper. They didn't know how to treat, spiritual gifts. They had a guy in the church who was sleeping with his stepmom. I mean, this was a messed up church. And the Apostle Paul opens the letter by calling them saints. Mm-hmm. So again, to be a saint is to be in the process of being sanctified, right? So that is God's vision for every Christian life, is that we would be saints, that we would be in the process of being sanctified, which means, again, it's this idea of conforming to the vision of God for our lives, right? As opposed to any other vision that could exist for our lives.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it's God's vision for us.
Okay.
So it is this process of conformity. There's no doubt that's there.
So that first statement again. So the vision of God for every Christian life is sainthood. I think that's helpful, I guess, just when we hearing that with that new understanding of what that means.
What it means
for
to be a saint.
Sainthood, right? Because if you have it in the Catholic definition, that's not quite what you're talking about there.
Right.
But that's helpful.
Correct. Yeah. So I want to make sure that we're dealing with the earliest maybe biblical picture of what a saint was. And just every Christian was considered a saint. That's the way Paul addressed them and others as well.
That's good. Okay.
So that is one vision for our life. But then you have this other vision for your life, which is kind of the dominant cultural vision for the way we ought to live life. In our culture, it's the dominant Western narrative, right? We've talked about that before on this podcast. It could be the postmodern narrative for your life, that nothing matters more than happiness. So you should pursue happiness at all costs. You have the ability to define your own meaning, to create your own truth. I mean, all these things. So go ahead and chase after those things, which in a sense tries to say don't conform to anything except what your inner heart wishes you to do. And so that is kind of, I think, sometimes the message of culture, although the reality is, even though culture may have that message for you, the reality is it's still a conforming to something. It's even if it's do whatever you want to do, it's actually conforming to the fact that culture is saying do whatever you want to do instead of control yourself. So again, back to this statement that the message of culture is let go of or cast off your inhibitions. This seems to be, by what the Apostle Paul says as he addresses these Christians in Thessalonica, that would have been true for them as well. Okay. Otherwise, why is Paul saying it's God's will that you should be sanctified? And then he tells them a number of things that they should avoid, right? So he says, avoid sexual immorality. Then he says, each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lusts like the pagans who don't know God. So to know God means to control your body. It means to avoid sexual immorality. He says, don't take advantage of a brother or sister. He says that what's going to happen is God will punish all people who commit sins like this. He says, God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. I mean, those are really heavy words. And in fact, he goes on right after that to say, if anybody rejects this instruction, I think he's kind of thinking of himself when he says, you're not rejecting a human being. So you're not rejecting my words. These are God's words. This is God's instruction. The same God who gave you the Holy Spirit is the same God that is inspiring these words to you about the kind of life you should live. But that stands in stark contrast to the message of culture, which says, indulge yourself. Which it seems that's the trouble that the Thessalonian Christians were having as well. It's the same struggle that we have today. And I did talk about There's this lady named Glennon Doyle. Glennon Doyle was a Christian blogger. She was happily married. I think she's got 3 kids, or maybe she wasn't so happily married. Maybe that's part of the problem. I don't know. But she was married. She was a Christian blogger. I think pretty influential, fairly influential, and I think had a lot of good to say that certainly seems to have some biblical truth connected in it. But she decided to walk away from all of that. When we talk about the deconstruction stories, or certainly even the deconversions, I mean, she would go all the way to being probably a deconversion story, embracing now some very loose spirituality instead of biblical Christianity. So she wrote this book a few years ago called Untamed. And her basic idea is this: my struggle and my unhappiness, my frustration in life was not because I was trying to live and become more, well, it was because I was living more holy. I was trying to live more holy. I wasn't finding happiness there. So what I needed to do was untame myself. Instead of allowing society, or not really society, instead of allowing some sort of influence to tame me, which would be the idea of controlling your body, not indulging yourself in sexual immorality and lust like the pagans. That was the problem, is that I was saying yes to those things, the things of control, as opposed to the things of casting off my inhibitions. And since I've cast off my inhibitions, I'm now super happy. And this is what life is really all about. So do whatever you want to do.
Directing that directly towards biblical principles, right?
Yeah,
There's not just cultural stereotypes or something, because there might be something admirable in some of them, but this is like, no, she's saying biblical standards, like these are taming people in a bad way. Okay.
Correct. And I think also maybe some influence of culture as well, but it's, maybe it's the culture that had an influence of the Judeo-Christian worldview that it's putting these chains on us when we need to break free of those chains, and then we can do the things we want to do and live life the way we want to. And so I'll just share with you a few things that she says in this book. She says this, she says, it is getting to this untamed place that leads her to say, I will not stay, not ever again, in a room or a conversation or relationship or institution that requires me to abandon myself. And really what she means by that is that requires me to embrace self-control, or not be true to my true self, whatever I define as my true self, in that moment happens to be. She says this as well, which I would love to get the chance to question her on this, ask her about this, flesh this out with her, because what I see is, I'll read the quote and then I'll come back and say what I see. She says this, she says, there is no greater burden on a child than the unlived life of a parent. Now, again, I'd really like to ask her, what do you mean by that? Help me understand that a little bit more fully, because what I see is when I sacrifice for my kids and I don't indulge myself, my kids are better off. When I become selfish and I say, well, I got to live my life, that's when things aren't so great for my kids. Right? I can start to see I'm neglecting my kids in different places. But maybe what she's trying to say is, look, I'm trying to be happy and I parent best out of a happy place. I don't know, but certainly it does sound like a very, very self-centered statement. She says this as well. She says, you are here to decide if your life, relationships, and world are true and beautiful enough for you. And if they are not, and you dare to admit they are not, you must decide, if you have the guts, the right, perhaps even the duty, to burn to the ground that which is not true and beautiful enough, and get started building what is. Now, the reality is, in some context, you could look at that and say, okay, I could see that, but it really depends upon what your definition of beauty is. And it's very obvious throughout this book, and I'll be honest, I have not read this. I did Audible this book, so I listened to it. But it's very obvious that throughout the book, the vision that she is casting for life is one that is unrestricted and unbound by any outside influence, and that is what beauty is. So whatever you feel like on the inside is good, you go do that. So it's the ultimate, it's a quintessential follow your heart. And again, it led her to abandon her marriage. It led her to pursue a relationship that many of us would look at and say, no, you shouldn't have pursued that relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, so that was what she decided. This wasn't beautiful enough. I'm trading this now for something else, regardless of what happens.
Well, I know yesterday you pointed out several times, I think you said in the message, that the point of this is obviously it's not to pick on somebody. Right. Glenn and Boyle, but that's just one pop culture manifestation
Correct.
of this broader attitude,
Yes.
right? So I guess
she just happens to have written a New York Times best-selling book that was on the New York Times bestsellers list for quite some time, and she vocalizes a lot of what the culture around us is saying. That's right.
And then my question for you then would be, so what's the problem with this attitude?
What is the problem with this attitude?
And some of that, that's obvious, but let's tease that out a little bit more.
Yeah, so, for us as Christians, here's what the problem is. Our call is to live a life that pleases and honors God. What Glennon Doyle is suggesting and what the culture around us is suggesting is you ought to live a life that pleases yourself. Mm-hmm. So please yourself. You chase after whatever you want to chase after, your own dreams. But there's a very contrary message to that in Scripture, which I think actually paints a more beautiful vision for life. Yeah. So again, it's the question of what are we determining is, how do we define beauty? Mm-hmm. Do we find beauty, I'm going to do whatever really makes me happy? Frozen, right? No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free.
Yeah,
I gotta go. Yeah, I've got a 6-year-old daughter, so I can get that one. But no right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. So if that really is the picture of life, is that there is no right, no wrong, there's no rules for me, and that is what freedom is, well, that's going to lead you to live in a very particular way. And it's not going to be the vision that God has for your life. Yeah. So that in the end is what's wrong with that, is that God has this vision for our lives where, yes, we say yes to self-control. We say yes to avoiding impurity for the sake of holiness. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, we prize holiness and sanctification enough that there are some things we say no to, and that we say there are rules for me. And God gets to help guide me in that, and really as my creator, he knows the best rules, and he knows why those rules should be followed as well. Mm-hmm. So he sets those guidelines, those guideposts, and I want to follow where he leads in that, as opposed to I'm the leader. Yep. And everybody can deal with it, and if you don't like it, that's just too bad, but this is what I'm doing. So again,
that's good.
Never going to be in a room again or a conversation or anything like that if I have to abandon myself, or no, I'm going to take Jesus' vision for me, which is to deny myself daily. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And take up my cross and follow him, and that to me is what beauty is about. So it's just, again, I think it's a real different vision for what beauty or what a beautiful life truly looks like.
I love that. Very cool. So all right, let's talk about kind of a couple of those words that you've used a couple times that are they're pretty big Christian words that I don't know if we always fully understand what that means. You talked about holiness and sanctification. Maybe first off is just simple definitions of how do you define those words, but then I guess maybe more specifically, more practically, is what does that mean for us to live a holy, sanctified life?
Yeah, so we took a shot at sanctification already. So again, I would say sanctification is this process by which we embrace more and more the vision of God for our lives as we live. Daily we do that. So it is. You could say it really is. It's being sanctified is becoming a disciple of Jesus and more becoming like Jesus daily. Mm-hmm. So that is the process of sanctification. It is the process of becoming more of what we should be and less of what we shouldn't. Mm-hmm. So I think it's both, right? So it is more and more the things that drag me down. And again, a very, very different vision for life. Freedom is saying yes to all the things I want, but the problem is what we actually see in Scripture is that when we say yes to all the things we want, we find ourselves more and more in bondage to sin, mm-hmm. right? So what one calls free, another calls a type of slavery. The Scripture would call it a type of slavery. And so, holiness is actually, or sanctification is actually then becoming more truly free in that sense. We're becoming freed from those things that would truly drag us down. It's the weighty things. It's the guilt. It's and so there's, I guess both visions for life are trying to become free from guilt. But I think only God has the real answer for how we can become free from guilt, and it's this process of sanctification, becoming more and more the person that God wants us to be, more and more conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. So that's sanctification. The idea of being holy, in the sense that God is holy and He calls us to be holy, is just this idea of being set apart. That's really what the idea of holiness is. So it's set apart. It's different from other things around us. So there were things that were set apart for the service of God in the temple that were just different tools that were used in the temple. So they were holy. They were set apart. We are now those holy and set apart things as well, in a sense, in that we are called to be holy and set apart for the service of God. So the same principle, but we're holy and set apart for the service of God, which means that we're not trying to serve ourselves all the time. We're not serving someone else. It's God that we're serving. So that's really, I think, the idea of holiness and sanctification go together in that way. So again, sanctification, becoming more and more like Jesus, the process of holiness, recognizing, or the idea of holiness, recognizing that we're set apart for God and that we belong to Him. Mm-hmm. So those are those ideas, just kind of, I think some good basic biblical concepts that all of us as Christ followers ought to understand. And it gives us an understanding then of the vision, again, that God has for our lives. And once we start to understand sanctification and holiness, we start to see that the vision of the culture around us, certainly the postmodern culture, but there are other cultures as well. I mean, every culture stands in opposition to the vision that God has for our lives to some degree, right? Every worldly culture. It just does. It's going to. God has something very different in mind for us. And so when we say yes to the things of God, holiness, sanctification in particular, we start to see just how counter or how different the vision that the culture around us has for us, how different that is from the vision that God has for us. So you asked about some practical implications of that to some degree. And the Apostle Paul deals with that toward the end of this passage. He talks about more holiness, more sanctification, more love. And then at the end of that, he says, listen, here's what I want you to do all together in all of this. I want you to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. And that's, I think, right around verse 11. And then he says, after that, in verse 12, he says, you should mind your own business, work with your own hands, just as we told you, so that in your daily life you may win the respect of outsiders, and that you won't be dependent upon anybody. So this is where we kind of started to land the plane and the message on Sundays, to have this conversation about what does it mean to live a quiet life, and how does that engage this idea of sanctification or holiness, and why are we doing all of this as it is? Now certainly there's a personal piece to this, but it's also because I think God's people are supposed to be different. I mean, think about set apart for what and why? Well, we're set apart to God, to honor God, yes, but we're also set apart to be an example to those around us. I mean, that's a big part of what the Apostle Paul has been talking about to the Thessalonian Christians throughout this letter, especially in the first chapter. He says, by the way you're living, you're an example to all the Christians who are watching, but they're also showing the world something. And as Jesus says, our call is to be a light that's not hidden under a basket, but is visible for all to see, so that it gives light into the room, that it is light in the darkness, and we're supposed to be those kinds of people as well. And so Paul, through calling us to holiness and sanctification, is calling us to be people who are truly set apart. He's also calling us to be people that are truly living principled lives. I mean, that is the whole call in this, is that, the point of all this in some sense, and at least in this passage right here, Paul says, the point of this is to win the respect of outsiders as they watch us live this truly devoted and principled life before God. So that is a part of the point. Yeah. When we think about the idea of being principled, what I said on Sunday is that we are not called to be obnoxious, but we are called to be principled. Okay, I want to read to you a second statement that I made on Sunday as well, and then talk about kind of the tension between these two places we can be in relation to these two statements. So the first, again, we're not called to be obnoxious, but we are called to be principled. There's no doubt about it, that we are called to that. The second is that we're not called to loudly condemn those in the world around us, but we are very much called to be set apart from the world around us. So again, these two places that we could be at opposite end of the spectrum, and the tension that lies between them. First is we can be truly very principled people, but be obnoxious and no good whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
To anyone around us. We're not attractive. We're not, in a sense, we're not winning the respect of outsiders, as the Apostle Paul says. Even though we're being principled, we're not winning the respect of the outsiders because of the way we're behaving. Now, I think inherent in this is the knowledge that even when we live principled lives, it is difficult to win the respect of outsiders. So when we become principled people, we're going to have to work extra hard to win the respect of outsiders while holding to our principles. If we become, the next culture warrior, where you're on a rampage, in a sense, and you're going to knock everything down and fight everybody that doesn't agree with you because you're trying to be holy and sanctified, well, maybe that's one way of approaching things, but probably not the best way. So you could achieve some sort of set apartness for sure. You could achieve some set of principled living or some type of principled living, but again, you wouldn't win the respect of outsiders at all in doing that. So again, you can be on this side where you're principled, but you're obnoxious. You're principled, but you're ugly about the way you're principled, so you're not kind and you're not loving in that. On the other side of this, we can just throw principles out the window because we'd rather try to appeal to culture in another way.
Yeah.
So, hey, I'm a lot like you. We're a whole lot alike. We're not that much different. Oh, this whole set apart thing, So we're not really truly set apart. In fact, we become sort of more a part of the culture around us, and then still try to sneak in some Jesus every now and then. When the reality is, Paul says, I want you to dedicate yourself to being more sanctified, more holy, and then add in the love piece as well, right? So it's sanctification, holiness, and love, and all of those together, and that gives us the picture for the kind of people we're supposed to be. You're supposed to be an absolutely principled person who loves deeply. Right? It's back to that conversation that we've had that reconnects with John 1:14. To be 100% full of grace and 100% full of truth at the same time. So be principled, be holy, but don't ever do it apart from love for others. Be set apart, but don't hold the world at arm's length in a way that you're never going to let anybody get close to you, certainly not close enough to really see who you are and learn to know why you do the things the way you do. You're just going to shout at the world about what they should do instead of letting them get close enough to you to see why you do what you do. And so, I think there's some real tension between those two things. I understand it's difficult. Again, what the vision that Paul is painting for the Thessalonian Christians is not an easy vision to live out, but it is the one that we must live out under pressure. We've got to both be principled people where we're not caving at all, but then we don't turn around and fight and we don't run away. It comes back to the tend and befriend piece again. Again, we love while being principled and not giving an inch as to who we're called to be. We're not going to conform. We're not going to give that up. So, this comes to the last kind of example or last kind of statement I made for how we might live into this. Again, to say we're not called to find our satisfaction by indulging in the things of the world. So don't give in to the things of the world. Instead, find yourself at a place where you're truly satisfied in God. And if that's true about us, if we're truly satisfied in God, then it becomes so much easier, I think, to live this life under pressure, because the things that are pushing on us don't become pressures, at least not the same way they were anymore. The temptations, the cultural pressures, the pressure to conform. No, we want to be who God wants us to be. The vision of God for us becomes more attractive to us the more we find ourselves truly satisfied in Him. So I think that's maybe some ways that we can live out what it means to be holy and sanctified, what the implications of that are.
I love that. So as we come to a close, just got one final question for you, our weekly question, and it's how can we practice this to be faithful to Jesus?
Yeah, I think it comes back to Paul's two more and more statements, right? To think about this idea of being holy and sanctified, and Paul says, you're living for God. You are doing it. In fact, you're doing it, he says. So he says, here's how you ought to live, and in fact, you are doing this. But I want you to do this more and more. And then he comes back and he says, about love, we don't have to talk to you about love. God himself taught you how to love because the Holy Spirit was at work in their life. And so he's giving them glowing praise for the way that they are loving, and then says, do more of it. More and more of love as well. So more of the sanctification, more of the holiness, more of the love. Incorporate these things into your life further. I think it really is a call. Again, back to this idea, I think in our Christian lives, it is easy for us, Ben, to get to this place where good enough seems good enough. We reach this plateau, again, talking about keeping the world at arm's length in maybe a slightly different way. We keep the world at arm's length, and they become our standard for what it looks like to be set apart. Instead of trying to go closer to God, we're asking the question, how close to the world can I be and still be set apart?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the world becomes our standard, but what the Apostle Paul is calling to us over and over again is to not let ourselves be at this place where we determine that good enough is good enough. That I've reached this place where I'm okay. A lot of people, I think, even Christians, even older, more mature Christians I've talked with, and they feel like they have at times plateaued in their Christian walk. It's going to happen with all of us. But sometimes there are these lengthy seasons of plateau, and it seems like the commonality in all those plateaus, especially those lengthy plateaus, is I got complacent. I kind of reached this place and I thought, I'm okay here, instead of continuing to strive for more. So here's how I said it on Sunday morning as we really landed the plane on this message. Is to, as we find ourselves under pressure, let's not conform our way of living to those around us, right? Let's not adapt the way of the world around us, but let's lean further into the way of life that God has set before us, right? So it is this contrast between around us and before us. And if you want to go forward with God, you have to look to the things that are before you. It's this idea, that the Hebrew author says, we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. So we're looking ahead, fixed on Jesus. Now, as soon as we start looking at the things around us, man, our relationship with God is going to bog down. The process of sanctification, our holiness, we're going to be bogged down. But as soon as we return our eyes back on Jesus and we start looking again, what is before me, the way of life that God has set before me, we start doing that again, the next thing we know, we're growing again in holiness, sanctification, all of that together. So it's the question of, are you conforming to what's around you, or are you looking ahead to what's before you in the end? And so again, more and more lean into holiness and sanctification, more and more lean into love, and don't be satisfied. Don't get to the place where you say, well, good enough is good enough. Be like God. Be easily pleased. Be happy when you succeed. But don't be satisfied. Always keep pushing forward.
That's awesome. I love that. That is a great way to close it today. And next week, we'll be back in this series.
That's right.
Concluding our last part of Under Pressure in chapter 5 of Thessalonians. So we invite y'all to join us for that. But before we go today, we have a couple things we want to let y'all know about.
Yeah.
The first thing is that Paul has released a new book called The Way Back. It is available on Amazon. It's available for purchase now, right?
Yeah, it is available for purchase right now.
Yes.
As actually the publisher released it about a week and a half early, so currently only the print versions are available.
Okay.
So the official date was supposed to be June 3rd. They got the print versions done a little bit early, so they released those. The ebook version will still come out June 3rd. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much any of these kind of retailers that you would go to do your online book shopping. And it is my understanding that it will be in some select areas here in Atlanta where we live. Obviously, if you're listening somewhere else, the easiest thing to do if you want to get a copy of that book is just go to Amazon and they will prime ship it directly to you.
Groovy. Yeah, it would be an honor if you check that out. We'd love for you to check it out. And in September, or I'm sorry, actually in August I should say,
September,
we will be diving into that. We're going to be talking about some of the content from that book, so it might be a great time to go ahead and read that over the summer, dive into that, and that'll be corresponding with some of our message series here.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the second thing to let you know about is that we are going to be taking a break. We have loved doing this podcast. It has been an awesome first season. But next week will be our last episode of season 1. And then we're going to take a break over the summer, and we will be back for season 2 in August. I believe on a new day. We'll be dropping on Wednesday mornings. So we would love for you to continue to tune in and still be watching your feed. We might drop a couple of bonus episodes throughout the summer, but we won't be doing the weekly release. We'll just take a little break, we'll regroup, and then we'll be back to it.
Yeah, look forward to seeing you guys for the last episode of season 1 next week.
All right, we'll see you all then.